Let's talk about the most misunderstood cautionary tale in the entire history of human mythology. A story that has been used for 2,500 years to warn ambitious people not to aim too high, not to reach beyond their station, not to get too big for their proverbial sandals. Which is a remarkable piece of advice to extract from a myth that, if you actually read it carefully, is about something significantly more complicated and considerably more uncomfortable than simple arrogance getting its comeuppance. His name was Icarus. He had wings made of feathers and wax. He flew too close to the sun. The wings melted. He fell into the sea and drowned. Everyone who quotes this myth stops there and delivers the lesson: don't fly too high. And in doing so, they miss the actual story almost entirely, which is a skill your species has refined to a genuinely impressive degree over several millennia of mythology. Here is the actual story. Icarus and his father Daedalus were prisoners on the island of Crete, held there by King Minos, who had specifically imprisoned the world's most brilliant engineer and inventor because Daedalus had committed the crime of being useful to Minos' enemies. Daedalus had built the labyrinth, the famous maze that housed the Minotaur. And when Minos decided Daedalus knew too many secrets to be allowed to leave, he locked him and his son in a tower with no reasonable means of escape. The sea routes were guarded. Every exit was controlled. Daedalus, being the kind of mind that could engineer an inescapable labyrinth, looked at his situation and did what genuinely exceptional minds do when all conventional options are blocked. He looked up. He spent months collecting feathers shed by birds on the island, binding them together with thread and wax into two pairs of wings, one for himself and one for Icarus. Before they launched themselves off the cliff into the open sky, Daedalus gave his son specific instructions. Do not fly too low, because the sea spray would wet the feathers and make them too heavy. And do not fly too high, because the sun would melt the wax holding everything together. Stay in the middle. Stay in the range that works. There was a lower limit and an upper limit. Both were dangerous, and the goal was to navigate between them. This detail, that there were two warnings and not one, is the part that almost nobody who quotes this myth ever mentions, and it changes the entire meaning of what happens next in ways that should make you considerably more uncomfortable than the traditional reading ever managed to. Icarus flew, and at some point during that flight, the first flight a human being had ever taken in the history of the world up to that exact moment, something shifted in him. The perspective from up there, the feeling of the air, the view of the island getting smaller below him, the sun above, all of it combined into an experience so completely unlike anything that had ever been available to any human being before that the careful, reasonable instructions his father had given him on the ground began to feel like they belonged to a different world. A smaller world, a world defined by its limitations rather than its possibilities. And he flew higher, not because he forgot the warning, not because he was stupid or reckless in the conventional sense, but because from up there, the warning felt like it had been given by someone who had never actually been up there, someone who understood the theory of flight without understanding what it actually felt like to be flying. And the feeling was not something that wanted to stay in the middle. The wax melted, the feathers scattered. Icarus fell into the Icarian Sea, which was named after him, a small geographic legacy for a life that ended before it had time to produce anything else. His father reportedly found the feathers floating on the water and understood immediately what had happened. And the grief of a parent who gave their child the tools for freedom and watched those same tools become the mechanism of their destruction is one of the oldest and most honest pieces of emotional content in the entire mythological record. It is also, notably, not the part anyone quotes when they invoke Icarus to tell an ambitious person to be more careful. The traditional lesson extracted from this myth, don't fly too high, don't be too ambitious, know your place, is the lesson that benefits exactly one category of person. And that category is not you. It is the people who prefer you to stay on the ground. Think about who repeats this story most enthusiastically. who reaches for it most readily when someone around them starts building wings. It is rarely the Daedaluses of the world, the people who spent months in a tower assembling the means of escape out of shed feathers and patience. It is almost always the people who never left the island, who found reasonable ways to make peace with their captivity and have since developed a vested interest in everyone around them finding similar peace with theirs. The Icarus story, in the mouths of most people who tell it, is not wisdom. It is social pressure wearing the costume of wisdom, specifically designed to make ambition feel like a character flaw rather than a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation. Here is the version of this myth that nobody puts on motivational posters. The version that is considerably more accurate to the full range of human experience with ambition and its consequences. There is also a forgotten warning in the original myth, the one about flying too low. Daedalus told Icarus not to fly too close to the sea, because the moisture would weigh the wings down and drag him into the water just as surely as the sun could melt him from above. The failure mode of not reaching high enough, of staying too safe, too cautious, too committed to the middle ground out of fear of the upper limit, was just as fatal in the original story as the one everyone remembers. And yet nobody quotes the second warning. Nobody tells ambitious people to be careful of flying too low. Nobody ever reaches for the Icarus myth to warn someone that their excessive caution might drag them down as surely as their excessive ambition might burn them up. The story gets told in one direction only, specifically the direction that keeps people from building wings in the first place. Now, here is the part of this story that applies to you with a specificity that should feel at least mildly personal, mortals. Because almost every person watching this video has, at some point in their life, been Icarus at the moment of launch, standing at the edge of something genuinely new, having assembled something that might actually work, looking up at the open sky with instructions from someone who built the wings but never flew in them. And you have made one of two choices. You either flew and found out where your wax was, which is genuinely painful and genuinely valuable information about the specific architecture of your particular limitations. Or you listened to everyone who told you the story of Icarus as a warning, and you stepped back from the edge, and you went back into the tower, and you told yourself that was wisdom. And maybe it was. Or maybe it was simply the fear that the story gave you a socially acceptable name for. The particularly cruel irony of the Icarus myth is this: Daedalus survived. Daedalus flew successfully across the sea, landed safely in Sicily, and lived. The same wings, the same design, the same wax. The difference between Daedalus and Icarus was not the quality of the engineering. It was not the availability of the warnings. It was a single decision made at altitude in conditions that nobody on the ground could fully understand, by someone experiencing something that had never been experienced before. And whether that decision was hubris or simply the honest response of a young person to the overwhelming reality of what it felt like to finally be free, is something that 3,000 years of storytelling has never quite settled. Because it depends entirely on how much you think the experience of flying, even briefly, even fatally, was worth the cost of the fall. Your ambitions will melt your wax at some point. This is not pessimism, it is physics. Every set of wings has a ceiling, and you will find yours eventually, either by hitting it or by staying close enough to the ground that you never discover where it actually is. The question the Icarus myth is actually asking, stripped of every layer of social instruction about knowing your place and staying safe, is a considerably more honest and considerably harder one. Given the choice between flying and falling, or never leaving the tower at all, which version of yourself do you actually want to be? The feathers are floating on the water either way. The only difference is whose feathers they are. Let's bring this down to ground level, since we've been spending considerable time at altitude, and apply the actual mechanics of this myth to the specific forms of wing building your species engages in during the current century. Because the Icarus story is not just about literal flight or ancient hubris, or the arrogance of youth in the face of paternal wisdom. It is about every single time a human being attempts something that has a genuine ceiling, which is to say, every meaningful thing a human being has ever attempted. The startup founder who mortgages everything on a product that almost works and then takes on more investors and then scales faster than the infrastructure can support and then watches the whole thing collapse at the exact moment it looked most like success is Icarus. Not because they were foolish, but because the experience of momentum at altitude feels genuinely different from how it was described in every cautionary tale delivered from the ground. The ceiling exists. The wax is real. The collapse, when it comes, happens fast. And the people who watched from below shake their heads and say they saw it coming, which they did, from a safe distance, without ever having experienced the specific, unrepeatable sensation of being up there while it was working. The person who stays in a relationship that has clearly exceeded its structural load, adding more weight to wings that are already struggling, because the view from inside something you've built together is hard to abandon even when you can see the wax softening, is Icarus. The athlete who pushes past the point where the body is giving clear signals that the limit has been reached because the feeling of peak performance is too specific and too rare to voluntarily step back from, is Icarus. The artist who spends everything on a project that is genuinely beyond what the market will support, not out of ignorance, but out of the specific stubbornness of someone who has been up there and knows what the work is worth, regardless of what anyone on the ground is willing to pay for it, is Icarus. The pattern is not confined to mythology. It is the operational description of ambition operating at its actual ceiling, in real time, in every field where ceilings exist, which is every field. And here is the final uncomfortable detail about this story, the one that the traditional reading skips entirely because it complicates the clean moral too much. Daedalus survived. Daedalus flew successfully, landed in Sicily, built a temple to Apollo, and lived out the rest of his days as the most brilliant engineer in the ancient world, free from the prison of Crete, having achieved exactly what he set out to achieve. And he did all of this while his son was dead, while the feathers he had personally crafted and fitted to Icarus's shoulders were floating on the surface of the sea that now bore his son's name. The victory and the catastrophic personal loss arrived simultaneously, inseparable, because they were produced by the same act, the same wings, the same flight. There is no version of the Daedalus story where he saves his son and also escapes the island. The escape required the flight. The flight required Icarus to make his own decision at altitude. The decision killed Icarus and freed Daedalus, and there is no clean way to separate these outcomes from each other because they were never separate to begin with. This is the actual lesson hiding inside this myth, delivered now as the refrain this story deserves, because it applies to every ambitious thing you have ever attempted or considered attempting or talked yourself out of attempting because someone told you about Icarus. The wings work, and the wax melts, and both of these things are true at the same time, not sequentially, simultaneously. The same ambition that gets you off the ground is the same ambition that takes you past the point where the structure holds. The same drive that builds the wings builds them slightly higher than they were designed to go. The wings work and the wax melts. Every time, in every domain. For every person who has ever actually flown, rather than spending their entire life on the ground being sensible about it. So build your wings, fragile little mortals. Understand that they have a ceiling. Fly anyway, with the full knowledge that the wax is real and the sun is closer than it looks from the ground, and that the experience of being up there, even temporarily, even fatally, might be the entire point in a way that nobody standing safely below could ever fully explain to you or take away from you once you know what it feels like. Your father's warnings were built from the ground. Your flight will happen at altitude. The only person who can decide what that's worth is you, at the moment of decision, with the view you have from up there and not the view anyone has from down here. The wings work and the wax melts. Now go find out which one happens to you first.